This is All India Radio. In the special program now, we bring you an exclusive interview with Professor P.P. Divakaran, an academician and researcher in the field of mathematical tradition of India on the history of Indian mathematics. The interviewer is AIR correspondent A.M. Mayusha.
Namaskar and welcome. Here we have with us an eminent scholar, Professor P.P. Divakaran. He is a retired professor from Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. After retirement, he has been associated with several institutions across the country. Supported by the Senior Award of the Homi Bhabha Fellowship Council, he has during this time been deeply involved in research into the history of India's mathematical heritage. He has lectured and written widely on the subject and is the author of the book The Mathematics of India, Concepts, Method, Connections, published in 2018. Today, we will discuss the mathematical tradition of India and its outstanding contributions to the world. Welcome to the show, Professor. My first question, sir. As an academician, you're from the field of physics. What inspired you to the history of Indian mathematics?
Well, of course, all such questions, they don't have simple answers. But, I'm not a mathematician by profession. I'm a physicist. But I'm a mathematical physicist. And I have always been interested in mathematics. But then what really happened was that after I retired, during the time I was spending in Chennai, I discovered that a very, very distinguished historian of mathematics of Kerala, Dr. K.V. Sharma, was actually a neighbor within walking distance of where I was staying. And I happened to have been introduced to him by a common friend. And I found him absolutely the finest kind of scholar we have in mind when we talk of Indian scholarship. He was very welcoming. He was at that time working on the translation into English of Yukti Bhasha, which had not been translated before. So I got into the habit of going there, and I learned a lot of things from him. So he asked me, do you want to read this book? I said, yes, I would like to. Then he said, why don't you try? It's in Malayalam. So that's how I got interested in the subject. And I dipped into it for over a year, and I discovered that it was actually a treasure house. It was full of wonderful things. That is how I got interested in the subject.
Moving to the second question. India has an exceptional heritage of mathematical geniuses, including Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. What are the factors that caught your attention to the 14th century mathematician Madhava or Sangama Grama?
That is a straightforward answer in the sense that, India has a long tradition of mathematical activity. As an old documentary was titled, it extended from the Indus Valley to Indira Gandhi. Many famous names, Aryabhatta, first of all, the greatest of them all. Then you mentioned Brahmagupta. I would add Bhaskaracharya and several others. But if you look at accounts of the history of Indian mathematics and Indian astronomy, the two are tied together, then you find Madhava's name is often not there. And then you discover that very many people educated in the sciences, for example, had not heard of Madhava. The scholars knew his name. Yes, Saraswati Amma knew, definitely. In fact, there are lots of discussions of his work in her book. So when I was reading Yukti Bhasha, it makes it clear that Madhava's work is on a par with Aryabhatta. In fact, I consider them the two great pillars of Indian mathematics. So that is how I got interested. The two of them, Aryabhatta and Madhava, have a distinction which other Indian mathematicians don't have. They created entirely new disciplines of mathematical inquiry. So it is natural that I got interested in Madhava. I wanted to know what actually he did and where the ideas that he developed came from. That is how I got interested. Secondly, I could read Yukti Bhasha because it is in Malayalam. Sanskrit, you have to have help from people. Technical questions arise. So there you are. That is my answer.
What is the Kerala School of Mathematics? What is its place and significance in the history of Indian mathematics?
First of all, I would request you and through you, the listeners, to keep in mind that there is not one Kerala School of Mathematics. There are actually two. Madhava lived from, let's say, about 1350, 1360 till about 1420 AD. In the 9th century, in a different place, the place which is now called Kodungalur, then known as Mahodayapuram, there was a school of mathematicians and astronomers, of whom we know two names very well. One is a man called Govindaswamy, the other is his son, whose name is Shankaranarayana. And Shankaranarayana wrote a book called Shankaranarayaniyam, or it is a commentary on one of the works of the first Bhaskara. So it is better to keep. That is the first Kerala school. If you like, you call the second one, the next one, the Madhava school, the second Kerala school, or as I prefer to call it, the Nila school. Why the Nila school? Because as most people from Kerala know, At that time, the 16th and 17th centuries in particular, this was a cradle of all of modern Kerala culture, all of it. Kunjat Tiruthachen was from that area. All the great Kathakali works were written not there, but under the influence of those people. Other art forms, Ayurveda flourished there, most of all. So I like to call it Nila School, partly because of my bias, partly because of my special knowledge as a Malayali, that this was a very, very special part of Kerala and of India. So that's the reason I call it the Nila School. But why, what is its special place? I think, first of all, who were they? Madhava was the first of the second Kerala school. And he had one student we know of, who had two students, both his sons and so on and so forth. Till we come to Nilakantha, who was a very, very great person, very, very great man. And in fact, in my view, second only to Madhava in a different way. Nilakantha had a disciple called Jyeshtadeva, who then had disciples called Shankaravajir and Achyuta Pisharati. And that's sort of the end of the Kerala school, or the Nila school. Why is it special? It's special because of the continuity. You know, it's very, very unusual to find in ancient times a line of succession of outstandingly good people working in any special area, whether it is Ayurveda in India or mathematics and astronomy in India or mathematics, astronomy, other sciences in later Europe and so on and so forth. So this was a very special thing that happened. The real reason why it is special, it is the high point in this long story of mathematics in India, for 3,500, 4,000-year-old story. And this also represents intellectually, creatively, the summit of this long story. After that, it died.
Moving to the next question. So, in your studies, you say that Madhava articulated the principles of calculus centuries before Newton and Leibniz. How do you justify that?
Centuries before, of course, is very easy because Madhava lived about 250 years before Newton did. 1350 born. Newton was born in about 1650. So the time, there is no question. And chronologically, Madhava preceded Newton. So the question is it calculus? Yes, it is calculus. And the proper justification of this claim will require very, very technical issues concerning what calculus is and how it is different from other mathematical disciplines and so on and so forth. That I will not go into. It's both in concept and method, it is calculus. The proof for that is that many of the things that are proved in Yukti-Bhasha, these are all claimed to have been first formulated by Madhava. Many of those things are done in a way which, if I take it from Malayalam prose and turn it into equations, it's exactly the way we teach the subject today in schools and colleges. Exactly the same. Some of them are so similar that I have actually translated one particular passage exactly into English prose, then into equations, and then that's exactly what you find in the textbooks. So in my mind, in fact, there is no question that it is calculus. In other people's minds also, there should be no question if they take the trouble to go through actually what Yukti-Bhasha contains. There is a difference, though. There is one respect in which Newton and Leibniz are ahead, even not in time, but in technical ability. Calculus was applied in Kerala by Madhava and his disciples to problems of a very, very specific kind. They're problems which arise in what is called the study of trigonometric functions. Newton and Leibniz, from the beginning, recognized that they are the same methods, exactly the same methods, the unknowingly the same methods, apply to a much larger class of mathematical objects, much larger class of what are called functions. But this is, of course, not a reason for neglecting Madhava's work or rejecting Madhava's work as calculus, because subsequently, if you see the applications and uses of calculus today in mathematics, Newton and Leibniz would have been astonished. They would not have recognized their own ideas in what's now called calculus. So I think it is perfectly justified. That's my view. I think more and more people agree with me, especially the mathematicians. More and more mathematicians agree with my view. In fact, one of the finest living mathematicians today who's interested in the history of mathematics, in fact, is a good friend of mine and a very, very fine scholar of Indian traditional mathematics. He says, I have no doubt that Madhava belongs alongside Newton and Leibniz. Not exactly the same words, but that is what he has said. So it's not just me. Lots of people now think so, that it is calculus.
What are the historical records that provide the knowledge and evidences for Mr. Madhava's contributions?
Madhava himself wrote very little. I mean, he didn't write it. He only wrote one or two little books, and these are manuals, astronomical manuals. But what we know from Nilakantha's great work, Aryabhatiya Bhashya, in which he gives the credit of almost all of these things to Madhava. He will say things like Madhavoditam or Madhava Nirmitam Padyam, and then quote a verse from Madhava. So the impression we have now, at least I have now, is that Madhava scattered his wisdom, whoever was willing to listen to him. And it is its followers who put them all down in well-constructed works of technical quality. Nilakantha, but most of all Yukti Bhasha. So the real source of our information is Yukti Bhasha. Trouble is, it is in Malayalam. That is a part of the problem.
Some mathematicians pointed out that Madhava and the members of his school applied the geometrical methods to obtain their findings, and it is different from the modern methods of calculus. What do you think?
Oh, I would not fully agree, because it's a technical question. The reason why I would not fully agree is that geometry and other disciplines of mathematics, such as algebra, in India were never separated. They were all mathematical knowledge was mathematical knowledge. They would have special names like for geometry or algebra, Kshetraganita or Bijaganita and so on and so forth. But they used algebraic techniques very freely in their geometry, and they used geometry to prove algebraic results. As far as calculus goes, fundamentally, calculus is a subject which concerns itself with geometric deviations from straight lines. Its algebraic version, you would say, the functions which are not linear. And the two are intuitively recognized to be two aspects of the same question from the beginning in Indian geometry and algebra. In Europe, on the other hand, they became formally joined together in the great work of the great man, René Descartes. So when Newton and Leibniz did it, there were two ways of looking at it, geometric and algebraic, because, you have a geometric figure, a curve, for example, like a circle, and then you will have an algebraic expression of the same geometric fact. You could work with either. But fundamentally, calculus is about nonlinear geometry.
Listeners, we are in conversation with Professor P.P. Divakaran about the mathematical tradition of India. Moving to the next question. It took more than 2 centuries for the work of the great Madhava to be recognized. What might be the reasons behind this delay? Yukti Bhasha, the primary source of his work, is written in Malayalam. Can we assume that geographic location and language barrier delayed the process?
Yeah, I think from a historical point of view, it's a very, very interesting question. I think some of the things that I say are very personal views. They may not be, other people may not agree with me. I think the fundamental reason was that the Miller School was largely self-sufficient in the sense that there were no close contacts with other parts of India. And I think there is a reason for that. Apart from the typical Malayali isolationism, which I think is an intellectual fact, there are other reasons. Kerala was never part of an Indian empire, ever. Till, it was never ruled by a power based outside Kerala till we became independent and the linguistic reorganization of states took place. So people were very self-sufficient, very autonomous in many ways. So they were quite happy talking to one another. That's enough for them. It is not just that it did not go out of Kerala. You must remember the villages in which these mathematicians lived, all of them lived together, were not more than walking distance away, one from the other. Trikandiyur, Alatiyur, Thiruprangod, then Kudalur, where Madhava himself comes from, according to me. They're all within 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers of one another. So it is very compact. It's a very special, very esoteric activity. It is not something which they took to the common people. So that's one reason. The fact that it was, most of the books were written in Sanskrit. And Sanskrit was supposedly known by all scholars everywhere in India. So it's something of a surprise that other people did not know. I think the explanation is what I just said a little earlier. Yukti Bhasha is in Malayalam, and that has had a tremendous impact on the absence of, because Yukti Bhasha is by far the most detailed, the most complete, the most sophisticated account of Madhava's ideas and technique, and that remained unknown for a very long time. The other part of the answer to your question is, when we say remained unknown, was neglected, we mean generally by Westerners, because we are all products of the Western education system. The Westerners didn't know about it till 1830, and that is when Charles Wyche gave a lecture in London in which he talked about the text that he discovered in near Kochi, I think probably in Kodungallur. So that is, why would they be interested? They were a colonizing power. The Europeans, the British were a colonizing power. They would not particularly care for it, even though in the early days of the East India Company, people like Colebrook and even William Jones took an interest in texts on subjects which we now consider to be scientific. But it disappeared, little by little people didn't know anymore. Kerala was a far corner, it's so far from Calcutta. It wasn't very much part of their, what shall I say, the view of India. That I think is a reasonable, I find that reason satisfactory. Other people don't.
What could be the factors that hindered the mathematical activities of Kerala school and prevented it from flourishing into a renowned center of learning? Did colonization play a major role?
This is part of the answer is already in what I said just a little while ago, that it was an isolated activity. When people were using these mathematics to write books on astronomy and subsequently to write down rules to be followed by astrologers, then it became, that kind of thing was widely known because people were strong believers in astrology. But Madhava's work is very, very pure mathematics by and large. It is very little applications in astronomy. So that would not have appealed to, let's say, Konkan was full of astrologers, the Konkan coast. It would not have appealed to them. So there is that. Then, as far as the Europeans are concerned, you must remember that the beginning of the scientific activity in modern Europe is a product of the Enlightenment. And that happened at about the same time as colonization started of India by Europeans. The European colonizers arrived in India at the point when the Nilaf school of mathematics was at its pinnacle. Nilakantha wrote his other great astronomy text, Tantra Sangraha, 2 years after Vasco landed near Calicut. So there was, and that destroyed the local support system for these activities. The Samudris were very busy fighting first the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the English. Then the temples lost their riches. Tirunavaya, for example, very rich temple, or Arathiyur, another rich temple, all in the same area where the mathematicians worked. All of them lost their wealth. So that is the reason why. And the Vasco da Gama certainly would not have understood what Madhava was doing or what Nilakantha was doing. He was just a very class person. Not like the Jesuits who came later. But even for that, there is very little evidence that the Jesuits actually understood this stuff. There is very little evidence.
To what extent the international mathematical community accepted the discoveries of Madhava?
Now, fully. It took a long time, but finally the international mathematical community, those who are interested, they know that this is very beautiful work. It's not just the calculus part of it, which we have talked about a little while ago. It is also so many other things that Madhava did, which are very, very modern in spirit. That is, which were done in European mathematics substantially later, not because they were not smart enough, but because those problems didn't arise in Europe till then. For Madhava, those problems arose while he was working in the 14th, 15th century. And he solved them. And that is now beginning to be recognized. Several people have written books, and many, many learned articles are coming out, and mostly by scholars from outside India. And so those who are interested is now very well aware.
Do you think our great mathematicians received less acknowledgement compared to their Western counterparts?
I think so, and I think that is also very natural. Europe, as I said, Europe got into the science game or mathematics game, astronomy game, whatever, the rational use of the intellect to understand the world better. As a result of the rediscovery of its Greek heritage, the classical Greek heritage. And that played a very big role in the Enlightenment, the renaissance of intellectual and aesthetic activities in Europe. And they were fully involved in understanding that. So even after the first texts were published from India, like Colebrook's book on the work of Brahmagupta and Bhaskaracharya in the beginning of the 19th century, it took a very long time for them to get involved in it, but they did get involved in it. So the Europeans naturally, there are puzzles, however. There are European mathematicians, mathematical historians, who till very late, till the first half of the 20th century, would still not accept, would still find it difficult to believe that all of this work arose independently in India. As far as we know, Madhava's work was not influenced by anything from anywhere else, except, of course, his primary source of inspiration, which is Aryabhata, 1,500 kilometers away in Bihar. So, yes, the Europeans tend to favor an interpretation of the history, which is Greek-centric. I don't think we should complain about this, because the real reason is, the real way to get over this feeling that some Indians have is to do our own history very well, very rigorously, as well as we can. I think so.
Sir, do you think in-depth studies are needed on the mathematical discoveries of the Kerala School of Mathematics or the Nila School specifically?
I think so, because for the reason being that, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of manuscripts lying around. And these manuscripts very often are about the same text, but there are variations in them. There are differences in them. And almost all of them are in Sanskrit, if you are in Malayalam. Of the important ones, only Yukti Bhasha is in Malayalam. Everything else is in Sanskrit. The amazing thing is that even if I take the main works of the Nila school, only about 10% have a translation. Forget about detailed commentaries. Just a plain translation into a language which more people, especially those not from India, can follow. Most of them are in Sanskrit, as I said. The Malayalam text has been translated into English, so that is now available. So there is tremendous amount of work to be done. It's not only here. I'm sure that the manuscript library in Mysore probably will produce a certain number of texts of this kind. For example, one very interesting manuscript of a standard classic of Aryabhata's, in fact, Aryabhatiya, was found in the museum in Baroda. Why is it interesting? Because on one sheet there is an inscription in Malayalam. This is how we know the genealogy, Madhava to Parameshwara to Nilakantha and so on and so forth. That's in Baroda. And Baroda Museum has many, many manuscripts. Mysore Manuscript Library has plenty of them. Our own Trivandrum, the old government manuscript library, are part of the university system. So there are plenty of things to be done.
Sir, as you mentioned, there are a lot of manuscripts across India. Just as the work of Madhava and others, many works of modern mathematics have been lost until various efforts like yours and others, specifically non-Sanskrit areas of other parts of India, which may have already lost to us. How should we go about rediscovering them from modern times?
I don't have a good answer for that. I think in the sense that, wherever they were, the community of mathematicians and astronomers wrote most of the texts in Sanskrit, the Sanskrit of that time, and sometimes colored by the region. But most of the texts are in Sanskrit. Even as late as 19th century, I believe there is a text from Orissa by a very well-known fine scholar. And Orissa by then was part of the British India. It was still in Sanskrit. As you probably know, the great traditional schools of learning in Kerala, for example, the famous one in Kodunallur, was active till 1930, 1940 maybe. So most things are in Sanskrit. So that is not a major reason why we have lost any knowledge. We may have lost manuscripts. But if you put them all together, if you look at all the things and try to find a continuity, try to find how ideas from a certain time influence what came later, I have the personal feeling that we haven't lost anything of great significance. That's what I feel. In the sense that we can actually reconstruct the flow of ideas from, let's say, Aryabhata onwards without serious difficulty.
Listeners, we are in conversation with Professor P.P. Divakaran about the mathematical tradition of India. So it is often observed that most modern mathematical and scientific thinking invariably traces its lineage to European and Greek thinkers over the centuries. What efforts do we need to make, in your opinion, so Indian thoughts, ideas and thinkers find their rightful place for concepts originally articulated by them perhaps much earlier than their European and Greek contemporaries?
These things are not done by deliberate action. It is not because some university or some government agency decides that we shall put Indian mathematics in the forefront, that Indian mathematics will come to the forefront. It will come when we have a community of scholars who are people of integrity, objective historians of the highest quality, unimpeachable objectivity in the way they look at their things, not false pride If we do that in course of time, of course it will not happen overnight, because these are not easily, these customs and habits are not easily changed. But that is, in fact, the only way. Besides, that will make us better historians, because, just by insisting on objectivity, our understanding of reality, in the reality in which we live, will be better, and that's very good. Especially the young people, we should concentrate on giving them an idea of India's achievements, hiding none of the great achievements, in fact, playing them up, but also not hiding things about which we need not be very proud. Vedic mathematics used to be very popular at one time. The fact is, Vedic mathematics is neither Vedic nor mathematics. The real Vedic mathematics is much tougher, much deeper, very much more significant for the history of mathematics in the world. If you ask a typical university professor, let's say, who is not interested seriously in the history of mathematics, the first thing he has to tell you is, oh, you mean Vedic mathematics? I say, no, not the Vedic mathematics you mean. So it's a complex question. It is, in my view, there is no miracle answer. You've got to work at it. You've got to work on our educational system and so on and so forth. So that's the way to make us feel, proud and objective at the same time about our achievements from the past.
Sir, what are the possibilities of the Indian tradition of mathematics to the new areas of innovation and technology, sir?
Wonderful. Very good. Actually, if you ask me, if you use the term mathematics in a slightly more general sense, in the sense of including what is sometimes these days called modern logic or mathematical logic, then I think it has already happened in the following sense. This applications of mathematics to technology or innovative sciences and so on and so forth, it happens in a very natural way. And generally what people use is in many fields in which the mathematics from the 19th and the 18th century are very useful. For example, weather forecasting still depends on mathematical methods first probably understood in the 19th century. However, the interesting thing is that from the very ancient times, mathematical ideas of very ancient times are rarely ever useful in modern technology. There are some exceptions to this. For example, cryptology, coding, encoding of information, the practice in using, internet transactions on banks and so on and so forth. They go back to certain elements of number theory which are very old. And that number theory, Indians contributed very, very significantly. For example, Brahmagupta. Brahmagupta, some of his work on what is called number theory is very directly relevant to this kind of thing. But more generally, as I said, if you include in the term mathematics, if you include mathematical logic, well, the first logician in the world, serious, active, rigorous logician in the world is not a mathematician, he's a grammarian, a very famous grammarian called Panini. Panini, the foundation of Panini's work is a classification of all objects into certain sets. When these sets are defined in a very, very modern way. That is to say, they're defined not by describing them, but by saying what they do, what their functions are, the elements of those sets, what their functions are. That is very much part of modern computer theory. Paninian methods are, in fact, there have been many conferences on the relevance of Panini's work on modern information theory. So it's already happening. But lots of things will not be applicable because, from our point of view, these things were great when they first took place, but they have been overtaken by modern things. Europe made tremendous progress beginning in the 17th century, beginning with the Enlightenment in the sciences. Modern science is essentially European science that we cannot forget. But as my good friends working in these areas of philosophy and so on used to say, but the streams that went to make this river large must not be forgotten. We must know the history of this big, big river called modern science. So that's my answer to that question.
Thanks a lot, Professor P.P. Divakaran. It has been a pleasure talking to you and sparing your valuable time for All India Radio.
You are listening to an exclusive interview with Professor P.P. Divakaran, an academician and researcher in the field of mathematical tradition of India on history of Indian mathematics. The interviewer was AIR correspondent A.M. Mayusha. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our website, newsonair.com. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.